To summarize Leviticus in one sentence, we could say, it is the Lord's devices. Can you guess what this means? Frame of the Old Testament. Please follow the sequence from ages, leaders, key places, national perspective, authorities perspective, to the genealogy of Jesus, then the book's allocation, and their representative triplets, and the spiritual perspective of prophets. Lastly, the chronicles of BC and Adam. Please open the book of Exodus, chapter 12, verse 40. Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. Since the entering into Egypt was in 2238 of the Adam Chronicle, the year they came out of Egypt was 2668. The Lord's device. The 27 chapters of Leviticus is divided into 5 subjects. It begins with regulation for offerings, followed by priest ordination, purifications regulations, and decrees, ceremonies regulations, and livelihoods decrees. Let's define a few concepts such as regulation and decree along with commandment and law. Of course, there are varying opinions on these concepts by scholars. However, in this class, regulation defines the law about the ceremony procedure, design, and specification of instruments in the tabernacle. Decree defines the law related to daily life among people, such as theft, assault, etc. Commandment defines the 10 Commandments, which was given by the Lord to Moses on Mount Sinai. Altogether, the regulation, decree, and commandment is defined as laws. Leviticus can be divided into 6 sections, 2 decrees, 3 regulations, and an ordination. Regulations are for offering, ceremony, and purification. Decrees are for purification and daily life, and ordination is for priest. First, offerings regulations. Offerings regulation from chapter 1 to 7 is divided into 3 parts, such as offering, procedure to sacrifice, and priest portion. Offering was the way to come before the Lord and restore the broken relationship with the Lord. Second, priest ordination. The ordination procedure of Aaron and his sons was described in chapter 8. It began with clothing Aaron and his sons in chapter 8, verse 4 to 9. And Moses consecrated the tabernacle by anointing with oil in verse 10 to 13. Moses presented the bull for the sin offering in verse 14 to 17. Then he sacrificed the burnt offering for them again in verse 18 to 21. He then presented the other ram for the ordination in verse 20 to 29. He took some anointing oil and some blood from the altar and consecrated Aaron and his garment and his sons and their garments in verse 30. Aaron and his sons stayed at the entrance to the tent of meeting for 7 days because the ordination lasted 7 days as stated in verse 33. Summing this procedure of clothing, consecrating the tabernacle, sin offering, burnt offering, ordination offering, consecrating them and their garments, staying at the entrance to the tent of meeting for 7 days. Aaron sacrificed a sin and burnt offering for him and did a sin, burnt, and fellowship offering for the Israelites as stated in chapter 9, verse 8 to 21. Then he lifted his hands toward the people and blessed them as stated in verse 22. This was probably the origin of the pastor's blessing at the end of worship today. Both Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's sons, died before the Lord, for they offered unauthorized fire before the Lord in chapter 10, verse 1. Moses told Aaron and his sons about the rules in entering the tent of meeting and their portions of offerings as stated in chapter 10, verse 8 to 20. Third, purifications, regulations, and decrees. Purifications consisted of two parts, regulations and decrees. Regulations were for food in chapter 11, childbirth in chapter 12, infectious skin disease in chapter 13 and 14, and mildew on leather and cloth in chapter 13, and mildew on a house in chapter 14, and discharges in chapter 15. All these regulations were related to pure life. The other regulations were for the Day of Atonement in chapter 16 and the place to offer and drinking forbidden blood in chapter 17. Decrees were for unlawful sexual relations in chapter 18, various daily lives in chapter 19, and punishable sins in chapter 20. The fourth, ceremonies, regulations. Rules for the priest and the high priest to be holy and their portions of offerings were described in chapter 21 and 22. Do we need to read or study these kinds of regulations? Many people ignore them because they think that they were nullified by Jesus. But you have to read and meditate on them. Why? There are wisdoms here to live by today as well. How was a priest to treat his wife? Open chapter 21, verse 8. What does it say? Regard your wife as holy, because they offer up the food of your God. That's it. As you are the spiritual high priest of your family, you should regard your wife as holy. Now, do you recognize why you should regard your wife as holy and respect her? Yes, because she is the person who served the Lord. This is wisdom from the Old Testament. You have to recognize that Jesus has never nullified the Old Testament and laws, except the various formal procedures and punishments. Those original intentions and spiritual concepts are still valid, which are summarized into love. He came down to complete them as stated in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. This is a way to apply Leviticus into your daily life. This is not musty at all, because the Lord is still holy, and you have to worship Him every evening with your family. Family worship. All members who attend it must be holy. Appointed feasts were described in chapter 23. Why was this following priests' regulations? It was because the feast represented Jesus, who is the highest priest. Let me further expand on this on the slide of feast implications in next class. The lamps in the tent of meeting must have been kept burning continually, and 12 loaves of bread must have been set on the table on the Sabbath, as stated in chapter 24, verse 1 to 9. A blasphemer must have been stoned in chapter 24, verse 11 to 16, and the eye for eye rule was described in chapter 24, verse 17 to 23. The fifth, livelihood decrees. The Sabbath year and the year of Jubilees rules were described in chapter 25. The purpose of the years was based on the rest and restoration of his creatures, and it was to fulfill his law. What was the Jubilee year? The 50th year after 7 times 7 years was to be consecrated as stated in chapter 25 verse 10. The Lord gave him a promise of a blessing in different ways if the Israelites had followed his decrees and had been careful to obey his commandments as stated from chapter 26:3 onwards. This is also valid today. We are eligible to receive His blessing if we follow His decrees and are careful in obeying His commands. Please look at His punishments when we disobey Him in chapter 26, verse 16 and onwards. It is very interesting because it may apply today as well. How did God punish? The offender suffered from sudden terror, wasting diseases, burning fevers, failing eyesight, life drained away, losing your harvest, defeated, ruled, and chased by enemies, as stated in chapter 26, verses 16 and 17. Of course, today it might be a part of God's providence, but we need carefully to think over whether it is God's punishment or not. This helps us build our Christianity and grow in our faithful life. Redeeming and tithe were for what were dedicated or belonged to God, as stated in chapter 27. All commands in Leviticus were given to Moses on Mount Sinai for the Israelites. Notice that they were not given for worldly people, but for God's people. The sixth high priest, Jesus. Now let's look at something related to this in the New Testament. High priest who resided a sacrifice of offering was replaced by Jesus, as stated in Hebrews. He came as an everlasting priest in the order of Melchizedek, as stated in Hebrews in chapter 7, verse 17. And became the guarantee of a better covenant in Hebrews in verse 22. Jesus is a permanent priest because he lives forever in verse 24, and he lives always to intercede people in verse 25. Then he is a mediator of the new covenant, as stated in Hebrews in chapter 8, verse 6. The covenant of which he is a mediator is superior to the old one. It is founded on better promises, the seventh laws of the New Testament. Circumcision was given by the Lord as a symbol of God's people in Genesis chapter 17, but it was replaced by the grace of Jesus, as stated in Acts chapter 15, verse 11. Do not judge anyone by what he eats or drinks or religious festivals, as stated in Colossians chapter 2, verse 16. Apostle Paul tells us about law's role. The sin might be recognized as a sin through laws, like in Romans in chapter 7, verse 13. Hence the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, righteous, and good, as stated in Romans chapter 7, verse 12. So we can't nullify the law by faith, rather we uphold the law. Romans chapter 3, verse 31. The entire law is summed up into one command: love your neighbor as yourself, as said in Galatians chapter 5, verse 14. Let me tell you about the law in detail on the slide of the laws. Look at Luke chapter 16, verse 16. It says that no more laws and prophets were proclaimed after a prophet John. And people can be justified by his faith apart from observing the law, as stated in Romans chapter 3, verse 28. Jesus came as a mediator of a new covenant, which is superior to the old one and better promise, as seen in Hebrews chapter 8, verse 6. Furthermore, if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under law, as declared in Galatians chapter 5, verse 18. Did Jesus nullify the law? Can we nullify the law? Not at all. Rather, we uphold the law. This seems to be contradictory to the previous passages. Jesus declared that he came to accomplish and uphold the laws, and no smallest letter will disappear. How to interpret these conflicting passages? Romans chapter 13, verse 8 defines the law as to love his fellow man, and chapter 13, verse 10 declares love is the fulfillment of the law. Galatians chapter 5, verse 14 supports this by saying that the entire law is summed up in a single command: love your neighbor as yourself. All the laws were based on God's love, our love for him, as stated in Matthew chapter 22, verse 40. This was also the basis of the law given to Moses. Hence, the law is spiritually still valid, which we should obey today. Thank you for watching.